Okay, we can start then. Welcome, everybody. It is my great pleasure today to introduce to you Guillermo Mene Sanchez, who is an FWO postdoctoral fellow at the History Department of Ghent. He studied history at the University of Oviedo and at Ca' Foscari, and then he obtained his PhD in 2022 from the University of Padua in the École pratique des hautes études, with a thesis entitled The 6th Century, sorry, I lost it. The 6th century anti-Manichaean polemic in the light of the main sources of Greek language, tradition, interpretation, and innovation. His thesis was awarded the prize of the Sociedad Española de Bizantinística for the best doctoral thesis on Byzantium, and is now forthcoming as a monograph for mimesis. Guillermo's research focuses on the history of Gnosticism, with a special interest in the history of Manichaeism and its legacy. His current project studies precisely the revival and extinction of Manichaeism in the Eastern Mediterranean world. Among his publications, I would like to mention his two most recent articles, Manichaean Mythology in the Time of Justinian, 2025, and Manichaean Christology through the Lens of Late Antique Heresiology, Between Stereotypes and Reality, 2024. Today, Guillermo will present a paper entitled The Figure of Addas-Adimantus in Christian Heresiology and Its Impact on the Image of Manichaeism. Guillermo, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Georgie, and thank you to all of you for being here. I would like to share my screen, Dan, if possible. Okay, so. Okay, everyone can see it, no? Right, okay. As you can see for the rather explicit title of my presentation today, I will speak to you about the figure of Addas, also known as Adimantus, probably the most important figure in the expansion of Manichaeism throughout the West, after Mane himself. However, if I have to start speaking about Manichaeism, I would like to remark that it is difficult to overestimate the impact of Manichaeism, a religious system founded by the South Mesopotamian prophet Mane in Christian history. Despite being influenced by other religions, Manichaeism considered itself to be the successor of Jesus' doctrine. In addition, Manichaeism is a religious system with a nearly infinite capacity for adapting to different cultural frameworks, and Rome was no exception. The religious conception of the regions where this group arrived and the personal ideas of the Manichaean missionaries who carried out this doctrine in those territories are fundamental factors in this adaptive process. And in fact, missionary activity was a pivotal point in the early years of Manichaeism. Mane himself proclaimed that he has been within the borders of Rome, and one of his epistles is addressed to the city of Edessa. However, in the West, the most important missionary was Addas, a disciple of Mane and a fruitful writer of doctrinal works. The Manichaean sources represent Addas as an important Manichaean figure in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, who was active in Syria and Alexandria in the decade of the 260s. In addition, Addas has several religious disputationes in Roman territories, and as far as we know, he composed various works in plural during his evangelical missions in the Mediterranean. The identification and analysis of Addas' work has been the subject of long debates in the academic community for two main reasons. The first is that his work seems to have had a fundamental influence on the adaptation of Manichaeism to the Roman cultural milieu. The second is that we have almost no information about them. The Manichaean sources do not detail the contents of Addas' works, and most anti-Manichaean sources do not seem to even be aware of the relevance of them. There is only actually one exception to all of this, which is, as you can imagine, Augustine of Hippo. A unique case considering that he was Manichaean for almost a decade. Thanks to his writings, we know many more things about Addas. First, that he was also known by the name of Adimantus. In addition, Faustus of Mileve, a Manichaean African bishop who enjoyed great prestige in the period in which Augustine was a Manichaean, seems to have considered Adimantus as the greatest Manichaean master after Mane himself. Furthermore, the contents of a work by Adimantus are preserved by Augustine. This work would have been, this work of Adimantus, a treatise in the form of antithesis in which the Old Testament is confronted with quotations from the New Testament. Actually, Augustine wrote a work, the Contra Adimantum, so as to refute this text from Addas. In addition, some authors have hypothesized that among the Augustinian corpus, there are some hints, not explicitly confirmed, that seems to refer to other unknown works of Addas. And finally, just as an introduction, we should mention the relation between Addas and the Manichaean text known as the Kephalaya of the teacher. The Kephalaya, or chapters, are a literary genre used by the Manichaean communities of the early Sasanian Empire, which expanded across Eurasia and Northern Africa together with these religious groups. Currently, the extant example of the Kephalaya are preserved in 2 codices in Coptic translation dating to the early 5th century. These are various didactic commentaries on Mani's teaching used as a catechesis in the Manichaean communities, and they constitute the only information available to us on various doctrinal points of Manichaeism. The attribution of this Kephalaya to Addas was actually first proposed by Michel Tardieu, and although it has some supporters, most of research on Manichaeism has been skeptical, no? However, even if we cannot validate, we can say, a direct attribution to Addas, the influence of Addas' teachings in this work has been argued by many more scholars, such as, for example, Timothy Petitpis and Paul Hubert-Poirier. In view of the aforementioned, Addas seems to have been a fundamental figure in the Manichaean expansion throughout the Mediterranean. In fact, the above-mentioned evidence and the most recent studies on the subject seems to confirm that Addas' writing had a huge impact on the characteristics that Manichaeans developed in this region. Therefore, it is very likely that the refutation of many Christian polemical works were aimed at doctrines originating from Addas and not from Mani. And therefore, it is essential to understand Addas' figure in order to understand the history of Manichaeism in the Mediterranean world. However, despite this importance, Christian heresiology demonstrates little knowledge of his figure. With the exception of Augustine, none of the authors or works of who were composed from the 3rd to the 5th century seems to have a precise image in the importance of Addas in Western Manichaeism. Nevertheless, a more attentive reading of anti-Manichaean sources reveal a change from the second half of the 5th to the 6th century. Sources from this period seems to know new details about this missionary. This increasing knowledge does not seem to be coincidental, but related with the last great persecution of Manichaeans in the Mediterranean, which reached its peak during the first years of Justinian reign. So, well, we start with the earliest records of about the figure of Addas. No, the first hypothetical mention of Addas could maybe be found in the first anti-Manichaean work written in Greek, written by the pagan philosopher Alexander of Lycopolis, end of the 3rd century or beginning of the 4th. The first interpreter of this doctrine to visit us was someone called Pappus, after whom came Thomas, and some others after them. Addas has tentatively been identified with this Manichaean missionary called Pappus, who appears in this fragment, the first Manichaean missionary in Egypt, just like Addas is described in Manichaean sources. The debate on this subject is ongoing. The first to identify both names was William Sexton in the 30s of the last century. In more recent times, Jacob Albert Vandenberg has also accepted the plausibility of this identification. On the other side, this idea has been rejected by Guy Strunz or André Villay, so it is an ongoing debate if this Pappus could have been Addas, no? However, the first explicit identification of Addas will came some years after, in the Acta Argelae, the first great anti-Manichaean Christian work, which had an enormous influence on subsequent heresiology. The Acta, a fictitious work, is presented as the transcription of a public debate that took place in the city of Carrae, modern-day Harran, between Archelaus, the bishop of the city, and Mani. According to the Acta, Addas was one of the first 3 disciples of Mani, together with Thomas and Hermas. And like Thomas, who was sent to Syria, and Hermas to Egypt, Addas went to the east. However, the Acta seem to contradict themselves later, when they state that Thomas was sent to Egypt, as we find in the work of Alexander of Lycopolis just mentioned, Addas to Stygia, and Hermas remained with Manes. When the disciples, this is Thomas and Addas, returned to their master, Mani had already been imprisoned by the Persian king. Mani sent them on a missionary journey again, in order to obtain the Christian scriptures. They obtained all of them and sent them to Mani, who introduced his doctrines into the sacred biblical text. Finally, the Acta claimed that Turbo, a Manichaean who appears in the work explaining some basic doctrines of Manichaeism, was a disciple of Addas, no? So the role of Addas as a teacher of other Manichaeans. As we can see, the information of the Acta about Addas is confusing, and his role does not seem to be very clear, no? And in addition, we must bear in mind that the other are largely fictional works, so the information of the Acta always must be treated with some degree of caution, no? However, after saying this, and regarding the concrete case of Addas, I think there are some general ideas that seem to be related with those that we found in the Manichaean sources, no? For example, we can find allusions to Addas' missionary activity, which is largely attested in the Manichaean text. Addas actually went to different regions according to the Act. The passage about Addas' role, along with that of the other early disciples, in the adulteration of Christian writings is also interesting, no? This information could be related precisely with Addas' biography. First, Addas was known for writing various works of biblical commentary, as Augustine says to us. Even if a role in the corruption of Christian writings is assigned to the three disciples and not exclusively to Addas, the information could reflect the role of the first Manichaean missionaries in the adaptation of Manichaeism to the developing biblical canon in the West. Among these missionaries, Addas seems to have stood out above the rest. As we have seen, Augustine gives evidence of Addas' role in Manichaean biblical interpretation. Furthermore, Addas' role as Turbo's teacher could be related with his authorship of various works, and the reference to his figure that we find in the Augustinian writings, that is regarded as the most important master or teacher after Mane himself. Finally, some passages of the Acta Argelae have been directly related to the writings of Addas. More specifically, the letter from a certain priest called Diodorus. Diodorus, having heard a speech by Mane in his city according to the Acta, decided to send a letter to Archelaus, summarizing various points of the doctrine he has just heard. In particular, this letter of Diodorus focuses on a series of antitheses in which the New Testament is confronted with passages from the Old Testament. As Jason Bedun has shown, these antitheses present many similarities with the antitheses that we found described by Augustine in the Addas-Adimantus, and this seems to suggest that directly or indirectly, this part of the Acta was derived from Addas' writing. The second source that mentioned Addas explicitly is Cyril of Jerusalem in his excursus of Manichaeism preserved in the Catechetical Homilies. Here, Cyril briefly mentions that Mane had three disciples, Thomas, Hermas, and Batas. This is Addas. However, besides this mention, Cyril does not include any other reference to the missionary, which ironically, or at least for me, is an interesting point, no? The fact that Cyril, who relies heavily on the Acta at some points of his description of Manichaeism, has not collected more information about Addas, seems to suggest that he actually does not attribute much importance to his figure. And now let us pass to the probably most important case of this first half of my exposition, which is the case of Titus of Bostra. According to me, this case clearly shows the importance of Addas in the reception of Manichaeism in the Mediterranean, and in turn, the little knowledge that heresiologists have about him. In fact, it seems that Titus wrote much of his Contra Manichaeos based on various works of Addas. This idea has been discussed in modern research. According to Julius Fameni Gasparro, Titus seemed to be aware of an intermediary author between Mane and himself, even if this author is not explicitly mentioned. In addition, the similarities between Titus' excursus on the creation of man, found in Contra Manichaeos 3:7, and the writings of Adimantus preserved by Augustine seems to suggest that Titus may have used a text by this author. Fameni Gasparro's conclusions have been expanded by Niels Arne Pedersen more recently. According to Pedersen, most of Book 3 and all of Book 4 were based on sources of biblical exegesis that were most likely related to Addas. In these books, Titus used first a source that largely criticizes and searches incongruences in the Old Testament, Book 3, and a source that seemed to argue for the excision of certain passages in the Gospel and the Pauline epistles and the retention of others, Book 4. Again, the contents of this book seems to be related with the biblical interpretation of Addas. And finally, Paul Hubert Poirier and Timothy Petitpis, in their analysis of Titus' work, highlight that the structure of the Contra Manichaeos of Titus present great similarities to that of another text associated with Addas, the Kephalaia of the teacher. In the introduction of the Kephalaia, these texts speak about 7 main mysteries that were revealed to Mani, that structure the Manichaean doctrine, no? And these points are actually remarkably close to the structure of the work of Titus. According to both scholars, Poirier and Petipis, this structure of Manichaean doctrines could have been readily used by itinerant Manichaean preachers in Western contexts, particularly those associated with the teacher Adimantus Addas. And they propose that we might even label the above doctrinal summary the Adimantine teaching, since the connection with this Manichaean missionary appears to be strong. Therefore, it seems that there is a clear connection between Titus' work and Addas' writings, no? And therefore, the Contra Manichaeos of Titus is one of the most valuable sources available for us for the study of Addas' influence on Western Manichaeism. However, Titus does not explicitly identify Addas as his source. He even omitted his name, and therefore it is impossible to confirm whether he was aware of the existence and importance of this figure. And finally, the 2 last cases of this first part, I will be quick with those 2. The first case is Epiphanius. Epiphanius does not add any substantial improvement. He follows closely the tradition of the Acta Argelae. So we find that Addas was one of the first 3 disciples of Mani. He carried out several evangelical missions, and he went to Judea with the other disciples so as to take the Christian scriptures. They took it and carried it to Mani, and Mani introduced his doctrines in the Christian scriptures. After Mani's death, Addas went to Scythia. So as we can see, a tradition which resembles closely that we found in the Acta. And the second option, the last author of this first half, is Theodoret of Cyrus. Theodoret of Cyrus, well, according to the Hereticarum Fabularum Compendium, again, Mani had 3 disciples, Addas, Thomas, and Hermas. Addas was sent to Syria, and his mission failed, and for this reason, Mani decided to call himself Christ and Holy Spirit. This is, Mani decided to adopt Christian elements in his teaching, hiding his doctrine behind Christian identity, and motivated by the failure of his disciples. So, up to this point, we can observe Christian sources contain scarce information about Addas. The information also is vague and contradictory. Based on the aforementioned evidence, we can conclude that Addas is associated with 4 main characteristics. First, Addas was an important figure in the first generation of Manichaeans, that appear in the Acta in Cyril, Epiphanius, and Theodoret. Second, he carried out several evangelical missions, this appear in Acta, Cyril, Epiphanius, and Theodoret. 3, that he was a teacher of the Manichaean dogma, that appears in the Acta by means of the reference to his disciple Turbo. 4, that he had an important role in the adaptation of Manichaeans to Christianity. This appeared in the Acta and in Epiphanius. However, the sources do not preserve concrete examples of these activities, neither what his teachings were, nor what specific role he plays in the adaptation of Manichaeism. In fact, there is sufficient evidence to suggest that some of the most important anti-Manichaean works were influenced by the writings of Addas, Acta Argelae, or the Contra Manichaeos of Titus, but none of them seems to be aware of it, at least not explicitly. The situation changed in the anti-Manichaean texts of the late 5th to 6th centuries, which mark a turning point regarding the figure of Addas. In addition, the new information collected by these texts seems to be related with the last great persecution of Manichaeans in the Eastern Mediterranean, which led to the disappearance, at least as a real force, of Manichaeans from the region. A good example of this turning point can be found in the first text I will take into consideration, which is the short abjuration formula against the Manichaeans, which demonstrate new knowledge on the figure of Addas that can be confirmed by means of other sources. According to this formula, Addas was also known with the name of Adimantus. Furthermore, I anathematize an Addas, also Adimantus, whom the same impious Mani sent to different regions of earth. The name of Addas and Adimantus here seems to be appositional, and actually this explains the use of the pronoun hon in singular. And for the first time, the Greek tradition actually seems to be aware of both names of Addas. In addition, the formula also associates the figure of Addas with various missionary activities, even if it does not specify the concrete regions of this mission. Further proof of this new knowledge on Addas is found in the abjuration formula known as Prosperi Anathematismi. This Latin abjuration formula, probably from the Ostrogoth kingdom of Italy and dated in the consular year of Olybrius, this is 526, is called such because attached to it we find the rejection of Manichaeism signed by a certain Prosper. However, it has been recently argued by Aaron van Spouwen in a new edition of the text that the name transmitted by most of the document is the female Prospera, so it is a Manichaean woman here who is abjurated Manichaeism. According to our text, the Manichaeans identify both Mani and Adimantus with the Paraclete. Let him be anathema whoever believes that the advent of the Paraclete Spirit, whom the Lord promised in the Gospel, could come among the apostles after the ascension of the Lord, was not immediately fulfilled on the day of Pentecost, but came many years after in Manes or his disciple Adimantus. This is a pretty strong thing to say because actually in the Manichaean doctrine, Mani is identified himself as the Paraclete promised by Jesus in John 16:14. So actually it's one of the main identity traits of the authority of Mani. So actually it's a pretty particular thing to see another person associated with the Holy Spirit. And actually, although the association of the Paraclete with Mani is widely attested, is one of the main points of Mani's personality, the association with Addas-Adimantus is unique to this text. And it seems, in my opinion, to be related with the importance of Addas in biblical exegesis. Even if there is no parallel information in any other source, in the Augustinian corpus we find some information that can be related to this association. More concretely, the Manichaean bishop Faustus directly attributes to the Paraclete, the Holy Spirit, the ability of the Manichaeans to distinguish which New Testament passages are true and which New Testament passages are false, which is with biblical exegesis associated the Holy Spirit. For the time being, I must reply to this point, for if Jesus, who was foretold by the Old Testament, now distinguishes, proclaims, and teaches that a few things from it should be accepted, but should reject most things, then the Paraclete, who was foretold by the New Testament, teaches us what we should accept and reject from the same New Testament. When he promised him, Jesus spontaneously said of him in the Gospel, he will lead you into all truth, and he will proclaim you all things and remind you of them. Hence, may the Paraclete permit us to do with regard to the New Testament as much as you show that Jesus permits you to do with regard to the Old Testament. Therefore, according to Manichaeism, the Paraclete is the source of authority for interpreting the Scriptures. It is difficult not to relate this concept with Addas' exegetical works. In addition, Faustus tells us that Adimantus was the only Manichaean authority who deserves to be studied after Mani himself. This comparison does not seem to be coincidental, as the Prosperian anathematismi seem to recognize the importance of Addas in the Western Manichaean community. Finally, again, Paul Hubert Poirier and Timothy Petitpis has recently noted that the structure of the Prosperian anathematismi, this anathema compilation, resembles closely again that we found in the Kephalaia of the TeTra and in Titus of Bostra. Again, considering this as a summary of Adimantine teaching. You can see that there are many more things, for example, in the point 4 related to anthropology. They, for example, the Prosperian anathematism speak about this myth, the seduction of the archons. This is the anthropogonical myth in Manichaeism, so a pretty anthropogonical thing to anathematize. They also anathematize the belief in the purification through the sun and the moon. According to the Manichaeans, the human souls, when are purified enough, travel to the moon, and from the moon they pass through the sun. So again, a relation with anthropology here. And finally, the final imprisonment of darkness in the clan. This is an allusion to the final judgment according to the Manichaeans. When all the souls will be purified, our evil part, which are the bodies, will be closed forever together with matter. So again, a close relation with cosmology and anthropology in this part. But for the rest, the anathema seems pretty close the teachings that we find in the Kephalaia and in Titus of Bostra. And we pass now to probably, or at least in my opinion, the most important anti-Manichaean lost work written in Greek, that of Heraclianus of Chalcedon. An ecclesiastical author who lived at the end of the 5th century and the beginning of the 6th, and whose figure is particularly elusive. We know that Heraclianus enjoyed a certain importance during the first years of Justinian, in which he was the Bishop of Chalcedon, actually. Most of the information about his work comes from scant surviving fragments or reports from other authors. Regarding these surviving fragments, these are preserved, some of them in the Doctrina Patrum, in which Heraclianus defends the Christological positions of the Council of Chalcedon. Regarding the information about Heraclianus preserved in the writings of other authors, these come almost exclusively from the testimony of Photius of Constantinople, who dedicates the Codex 85 of the Bibliotheca to the discussion of a treatise by Heraclianus against the Manichaeans. Although no fragment of the work has survived, the notice of Photius contains some very interesting information. According to Photius, Heraclianus expressed his opinion regarding the most important Greek anti-Manichaean writings that were present to him. This Heraclianus speaks about the Acta Argelae, the Contra Manichaeos of Titus of Bostra, the treatise of George of Laodicea, the work of Serapion of Tumuis, and the treatise of Diodorus of Tarsus, now lost. Heraclianus adds very specific information about Titus and Diodorus, both on the same subject, the influence of Addas in these two anti-Manichaean works. He also gives a list to those who wrote against the Manichaeanity and the impiety of Manichaeos before him. Hegemonius, who wrote out the Disputations of Archelaus against Manes, Titus, who seemed to have written against the Manichaeans, but he rather attacked the writings of Addas, also George of Laodicea, who uses nearly the same arguments, Diodorus, I'm going directly to Diodorus, who wrote 25 books when conducting his campaign against the Manichaeans, in the first 7 of which he imagines that he's refuting the living gospel of Manichaeus, but he fails to do so, and refutes instead the works of Addas named Modion. This is bushel. So, according to Photius, Heraclianus was the first Greek writer to explicitly mention various works of Addas. Furthermore, Heraclianus was able to recognize the influence of Addas in heresiological literature, and the fact that his influence went unnoticed by several authors, such as Titus and Diodorus. Heraclianus is even able to name the title of one of Addas' books, the Modios, a work that is not attested by any other source and on which various hypotheses has been formulated. Furthermore, the information of Heraclianus on Titus is supported by some contemporary research on Addas. The fact that some of Addas' writings were refuting the Contra Manichaeos of Titus of Bostra is actually supported by recent research of Julius Faneni Gasparro, Pedersen, and Paul Hubert Poirier and Timothy Pettit. So actually, he is in line with modern research, Heraclianus, speaking about Titus of Bostra's work. Therefore, with Heraclianus, heresiological literature seems to become aware, at least explicitly, of the literary role of Addas within Manichaeism. Unfortunately, we do not have any other information about the content of Heraclianus' book. According to Photius, he wrote against the Living Gospel, the Book of Giants, and the Treasuries. However, it seems likely that Heraclianus knew various doctrines attributed to Addas, and that he analyzed it or at least mentioned some of them in his work. And actually, the information of Heraclianus finds support in the most important anti-Manichaean work of the 6th century, the Capita Septem contra Manichaeos, again an abjuration formula composed in the first years of Justinian reign, and most likely to be attributed to Zacharias Rhetor, the bishop of Mytilene and a leading intellectual figure in the first half of the 6th century. The formula presents some information on the figure of Addas that can be related to what we have seen so far. First, the Capita, in the second anathema, preserves a list of Manichaean books, and among them we can find one attributed to the names of Addas and Adimantus, again, as you can see, the law, the holy Moses, and the other prophets. This work against the law, Moses, and the prophets has been generally identified with the work that Augustine refutes in the Contra Adimantum. This book would be composed, as I already told you, as a series of antitheses against the law and the prophets, the Old Testament, and it will oppose the Old Testament to the scriptures of the New One. In view of this type of content, it seems to correspond to the title of Addas' book preserved in the Capita. The following information on the figure of Addas appears in the 4th anathema. Here, the names of Addas and Adimantus are linked to the rejection of Jesus' incarnation. Even if Manichaeus and his disciples, Addas and Adimantus, who along the Hellenes, the pagans, and the Jews, do not believe in the mystery of the whole incarnation, explode with fury. On this subject, which is extremely complicated, Christian tradition has usually stereotyped and simplified the Manichaean vision of Jesus, and in fact, the term Manichaean is a term of opprobrium in the Christological debates, Normally, Manichaean is used, we can call it as a theological insult against Miaphysites in the 6th century, and especially with the most extreme trends of Miaphysitists, that doubt Jesus' incarnation. This is docetic Miaphysites. However,
Manichaean Christology is actually not docetic stricto sensu. It's not based on the apparent body of Christ, we can say, but on the existence, according to the Manichaeans, of different figures identified with Jesus. And these figures, in fact, this is the interesting thing, these different figures identified with Jesus are collected in the Capita Sete, in the Anathemas 4 and 5, just after linking Addas-Adimantus with the Manichaean vision of the Incarnation. Therefore, in the fourth anathema, we find a figure identified with Jesus who enters the waters of the Jordan River, and a second, fully divine one, the real Jesus, in corporeal and cold splendor, who emerges from them. I anathematize, therefore, those who think differently in any way, and say that there was one person born from Mary, the one whom they call Jesus the Begotten, who was baptized and about whom they invent the story that he was immersed, but that there was another one who came out of the water, about whom testimony was given by his Father, and whom they call Christ Jesus the Unbegotten. Likewise, in the fifth anathema, we find a figure identified with Jesus who suffers the passion and the crucifixion, and a second, fully divine, the real Jesus, who observes from far away how the other Jesus is crucified instead of him. I anathematize those who say that our Lord Jesus Christ suffered in appearance, and that there was one who was on the cross, and another who could not be held fast by the Jews, but loved because someone other than him was hung on the wood. Both passages preserved in the Capita have in fact several parallels with Manichaean sources, and for this reason, this abjuration formula is probably the best informed heresiological work on Manichaean Christology of the entire Christian tradition. Therefore, up to this point, the Capita are an exceptional witness to the figure of Adam and various of his doctrines regarding both the Old Testament, mentions of works against the Old Testament attributed to Addas, and the New Testament, considering that Addas is linked with the incarnation in Manichaeism. This is Christology. In fact, the incarnation of Christ, the second subject, does not seem to fit with the work mentioned by the formula, focus on the law, Moses, and the prophet. Therefore, the information collected by the Acta seems to derive ultimately from various writings of Addas. It is difficult to know if the Capita took the information directly from Manichaean works or to an intermediate source, actually. I would like to mention that in this question of Capita sources, the error that the mistakes that the Capita Sete presents regarding the figure and the names of the Manichaean missionary, since the Capita seems to consider Addas and Adimantus as two different persons, literally oitutu mathetai, Addas kai Adimantus, the disciples of them. And the Capita seems to commit this error twice, regarding first the rejection of the Old Testament by mentioning a work against the law and the prophet associated with the name of Addas and Adimantus. No, Adda kai Adimantus ugraphen. There is no hints in the Acta that the text considered these two names as belonging to the same person in any case. And the incarnation, it commits the error speaking about the rejection of the incarnation of Addas and Adimantus. No. Maybe this repeated error could be indicative that this error could have been present in the source that the Capita took, and that this source could be a unified, maybe a compilation of Addas doctrine. It is a possibility, but I cannot rule out the idea just to tell that maybe this error, considered it plural, was an error committed in the copy process, of the manuscript. So it cannot be ruled out in the way. Just in any case, just to mention this particularity, that the formula is so precise, speaking about the doctrines attributed to Adda, but commits an error regarding the figure of Adda itself, which is a pretty curious thing. In any case, and leaving aside the direct source of the Capita, and the information collected by the formula, this is my point, does not seem to be isolated. Like the short formula, the Capita know the names of Addas and Adimantus, even if the author seems to think that they are two different people. The importance of Addas in biblical exegesis, which seems to be the base of the information of the Prosper Anathematism, is also present in the Capita, in view of the mention of a work focused on the Old Testament and the relationship established between Addas and the incarnation of Jesus, New Testament. Furthermore, the reference to various Addas works, of Addas present in Heracleus of Chalcedon, seems to be present also in the Capita. It does not seem that the incarnation of Jesus could be included in a work focused on the Old Testament, such as the book mentioned in the second anathema. In view of the aforementioned, we can affirm that the anti-Manichaean of this time mark a turning point in Christian literature knowledge regarding the figure of Addas and his works. For the first time, there are clear signs that heresiology is aware of the importance of his figure in Western Manichaeism and consequently in the image that Christian authors have of Manichaeism. Finally, we must remember that the contents of the 5th to the 6th century seems appropriate for this improvement in the knowledge on Addas. These years meant the time of the last great persecution of Manichaeans in the Eastern Mediterranean, and consequently its substantial extinction from the region. This persecutory environment could be ideal for the discovery and confiscation of original Manichaean texts. In short, it seems likely that the new knowledge on the figure of Addas that appear in Christian sources between the end of the 5th and the beginning of the 6th century is related to the circulation of real information on Manichaeans that is not previously attested, in a period in which Christian authorities persecuted this group in the Eastern Mediterranean with renewed vigor. And for my part, that's it. Thank you very much for your attention throughout all this time. Really, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Guillermo, for a fascinating talk about a fascinating subject. Might just let's see if I can. So now we have time for questions. As usual, if you have them, you can raise your digital hand. If you're not able to speak, you can also type your question in the chat. We're happy to read it. Maybe just to start us off, I'm wondering whether you could say something about the challenges on working with these sources, which are clearly coming from a varied, many different regions, but also you have Latin and Greek ones. Can you say something maybe specifically about other differences, specifically between the Latin and the Greek ones, where you're working sort of difficulties working with technical terms, and also more generally, given these different regions where these sources are written, and you mentioned that Manichaeism also adapts to when depending on the region where it is being, where the missionaries are going to. Can you say something maybe specifically in terms of what Addas himself has adapted from Mani, whether it's sort of, can you tell certain differences between your sort of the original doctrine and his adaptation of it?
Sure. Regarding working from sources from different regions, I actually think it's an ironical thing, but I think the Latin sources present a huge problem, which is Augustine itself. Augustine is so well informed that sometimes one fears that the information of Latin sources came from Augustine or is actually an improvement. No, so it's always difficult to know the Augustine traditions of Manichaeism in Latin sources. No. In any case, the information of the Prosperi Anathematisme about the Paraclete found some parallelism in Augustine, but is not attested in Augustine, is my point. So it does not seem that this has been taken directly from Augustine writing. But for example, one of the huge problems that you have sometimes with Latin sources is, okay, this source is telling me something new, or he just simply take one of the 200 works that Augustine wrote against the Manichaeans, actually. Yeah, actually, I'm seeing that the Neoplatonic Simplicius also seems to have, wait a second, reliable information. But the question of Simplicius sources that Adrian Pirtea has just asked is I will come up to the changes of Addas after. Let me take the question of Simplicius. It has been a debate. Michel Tardieu and Scott Hadot defend that actually Simplicius, during his years of exile in the Sasanian Empire, met a Manichaean community and he speak directly with them. Ultimately, I'm not persuaded by the arguments of Michel Tardieu and Scott Hadot. I think it's a possibility, but they defend this idea as the only possible explanation. There are really good information in sources of the 6th century, the time of Simplicius, circulating inside the Roman Empire. So Simplicius could have took his information among Manichaean communities inside the empire, that this circulation that seems to be flowing around the anti-Manichaean writers. And regarding the change that Addas introduced in Manichaeism, Addas seems to have been a way more systematic writer, actually, than Mani was. No, Mani is normally asserted that Mani could be maybe classified as a prophet, but not as a theologian. Addas, on the contrary, seems to have been, we can call it the pole of Mani. He has to systematize and create a message so as to adapt Manichaeism to the Western region in a period, and this is the interesting question, in which the canon as a concept, biblical canon, was in the process of developing. So Addas interact with it constantly evolving environment. It has been noted actually by some authors, and this is that Addas seems to be, for example, in the letter of Diodorus to Archelaus, this letter that is found in the Acta Archelae, Addas seems to use a very concrete biblical canon, which is the Gospel of Luke and 10 concrete Pauline epistles, which is actually the canon of Marcion of Sinope, is the canon of the Marcionite Bible. And this has raised the question, and for Marcion also was known for defending his position within a text known as the antithesis of Marcion, in which he opposed the Old Testament against the New Testament, practically inaugurating a genre within Christianity, and it's the same genre that Addas seems to have used in the work refuted by Augustine in the Addas-Adimantus. So this has raised the question about the relation between Addas and Marcion. No, there are some authors, for example, that actually think directly that Addas would convert from Marcionist to Manichaeist, and that he has preserved many Marcionite ideas. Others that Addas, probably because the closeness that there is between Manichaeans and Marcionite, took many elements and borrowed many elements from this Marcionite tradition, and also from Marcion student Apelles. No. Therefore, he seems that many Marcionite ideas took his way inside Western Manichaeism thanks to Addas. And actually, you can find that while Mani rejected most of the Old Testament, but was open to the exegesis of many passages, such as, for example, Genesis, the later the Manichaean works of the Western Roman Empire are, the most aggressive against the Old Testament are, no? And this has been took if maybe this could be indicative of a second wave of Manichaean biblical exegesis represented by Addas, who represent a harsh approach against the Old Testament, and if that could have many influence about in Marcionite ideas that Addas seems to have adopted. I don't know if that answers the question.
Very much so. I have another smaller one. You mentioned this. There was this early pagan philosopher who was talking about Mani's doctrine. I forget his name. Alexander of Lycopolis, I think. Yeah. So
Alexander.
Is he representing Mani as a Christian, or is it a separate religion? Just curious.
He has a problem with that. It's an interesting question because actually he speaks about the biblical canons of Manichaeism, of how Manichaean interpret the scriptures. No. Ultimately, he seems to he's probably one of the softest critiques that you can find to Manichaeism in the Roman Empire. He's not that aggressive, so he seems to ultimately consider them somewhat of sui generis Christians, probably. No, he, for example, speaks about the centrality of Christ in their teachings. He, for example, also mocks them for believing in his myths, we can say, or his doctrine as revealed truth, as not as a Middle Platonist like him. He was a Middle Platonist, believes in the Homeric myths, for example. Some traits that you can find normally applied in the critiques from pagans to Christians. So it seems to fall closer to the Christian side, actually, the depiction of Manichaeism. And sorry, I'm seeing a question from Hakon.
Yeah, I'll just read it. That might be useful if people watch the recording. Could you say a bit more about how you conceptualize the relationship between Adda and the Kephalaia? Do you think Adda should primarily be associated with the Berlin Codex? And if so, how do you consider its relationship to the Dublin Codex?
This is a pretty complicated question, actually. As I told you, Tardieu proposed it because this Kephalaia called the Kephalaia of the teacher, no? The other teacher is a rank in the Manichaean church, a rank that has been occupied by Addas for a certain point. So actually, Tardieu the idea that this Kephalaia of the teacher were the Kephalaia of Addas. However, the direct attribution, I do not see it actually. I have the sensation that, first of all, the layers of the Kephalaia are a complicated question because they are chapters that work as some sort of a catechesis in Manichaean community. So it's a literature which is very prone to include more addings. No, so there could be many layers among the Kephalaia. In my personal opinion, I think that maybe some we can call it later layers of the Kephalaya, would have some relation with others. For example, this structure of the Manichaean teaching, in 7 mysteries that seems to be present in other works. But sincerely, I do not think how actually to situate Addas inside that many layers of reworkings of the text. I'm sorry about this, but I found it extremely complicated, and I don't know if I came up with a definitive question on this.
Okay, George has a question as well.
Yes, I do. So first, thank you very much, Guillermo, for this rich presentation. I have a smaller question. You made a very good case showing us that in the 6th century, thanks to, or because of the persecution, we have this moment of maximum knowledge of around the figure of Adda and his writing. So I was just wondering what happens afterwards, if the persecution marks also an end of any engagement with Adda or Adda, or if we have some other sources bearing some.
Well, after execution, I have the personal idea that Adda ends up becoming dominant so these ideas of Addas became dominant actually in the West. It's an interesting question because after the persecution of the 6th century, we find many Manichaean revivals, for example, in the Arab world. It should be an interesting study case to see if these not that Western communities continue to present many influence of Addas or not. But for example, the Arab sources does not seem to be that engaged with Addas environment. So I have the sensation that maybe this persecution of Manichaeans in the 6th century could have especially hit this, we can call it Adimantine branch of the Manichaeans, actually.
I might have another question.
Sure.
In relation to the 3 figures who are identified as disciples of Mani, so you have Adda, Thomas, and Hermas. How do you feel about this coincidence that 2 of them are sort of major apostles in the East, and Thomas is sent, the tradition with Thomas sent to India, and Adda is there in the East first? What is it sort of, what do you think? Is that a coincidence, or is his name actually Adimantus, and is it sort of adapted to fit that kind of tradition, or what do you think is going on?
Regarding the missions, the various missions of Addas, that seems in different geographical places that seem pretty fitting with Manichaean sources themselves. Addas seems to have traveled to east and to the west from both of them. It is true that at a certain point among Manichaean sources, a Middle Iranian fragment, it is stated that when he arrived to the west, they told you have to stay here. So Addas seems to have stayed for a long time in the west, and therefore his name and his influence become associated. With the question of the Apostle Thomas to India, there are some association with this, we can call it apocryphal legends of Christianity about the travel of the apostle, all this literature that was circulating at Mani's time, precisely, if Mani could have made use by himself of these traditions, or if they have applied anti-Manichaean, this tradition to the disciples of Mani so as to fit them in a biblical canon. Sincerely, I wouldn't be that much able to offer you a definitive answer about this question. The idea that these apostles travel quite a lot is basically attested in Manichaean sources, and they do not limit their activity to one region. Actually, the Manichaeans, they have seemed to be pretty active in this period from the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean. They have seen quite an active network of traveling at this period.
All right. Marion has a question as well.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I was curious about a passage that you shared from Epiphanius, where Addas is linked to Syria, Palestine, and where it says that he went to Judea to obtain the scriptures. And I was curious if this is a wider tradition that you notice, and what the significance of it is. Does it suggest that he therefore had a trustworthy basis for his exegesis? Or rather, is it a strategy to align him maybe with latency Judaism? Or I was curious if you have any further thoughts on this.
Could you repeat the question? Okay, 1 second, I did not hear it well.
Yeah,
sorry.
so my question is about the passage from Epiphanius that you shared.
That he went to Judea, okay.
And placing Addas in Syria, Palestine, and that he obtained texts there. Biblical texts.
That it could be related with some Jewish
religious apocrypha, you say, so that
I was curious, so where his textual basis for his interpretations comes from, if this is something that where you encounter.
Well, the question that go to Judah, first of all, it's a pretty attested question since the very beginning. It seems that the Manichaeans are actually was speaking with Georgia some weeks ago in a team reunion that actually the history of the Manichaeans in this region is probably the most consistently and well attested from an earliest period. It seems that Manichaeism took root very, very, very early there. Actually, Epiphanius also mentioned that the Manichaeans are also known as the Aquanids because a preacher called Acuas who arrived in this region, first of all. So actually, Epiphanius always speaks that the Manichaeans arrived here pretty early, which is actually is a pretty logical thing. If you, if that could be related, what readings Mani use of the Bible is a subject that is debated by itself. We are pretty know that the Jewish apocrypha, for example, Mani seems to have been, well, in Enochic traditions for sure. The Apocalypse of Adam is explicitly, for example, speaking about Jewish apocrypha, is quoted by Mani in the Cologne Mani Codex, actually. So if this could be related with his engagement with these writings, yeah, it could be actually. It is a possibility, and it's find some further evidence among the Manichaean sources themselves that Mani actively engaged because he was born in a Jewish Baptist community, probably Kedelkasite, so he was pretty acquainted with this literature.
Thank you. It's very interesting. Thanks, Guillermo.
Okay. If anyone has any pertinent question that they really want to ask, now's the time. Last chance. Okay, that leads me to thank Guillermo for a wonderful talk. Thank you very much, Guillermo.
Thanks to you.
And thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you next time. Have a nice day.
Thank you. Thank
Bye.
you, Guillermo. Thank you. Bill.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Ciao. Bye.
Until next
Bye.
time.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye bye.